Maybe the most impressive part of the 2022 Orioles team was their bullpen. It was top 5 of the big leagues for most of the year, and two guys who really made that happen was Joey Krehbiel in the first half and Bryan Baker in the second half. And coming up, we'll look at both of their 2022 seasons on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, October 27th, 2022, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and today we are joined by Dillon Atkinson. He is back on the podcast here for our player review series as we talk Joey Krehbiel and Bryan Baker. You can find some of his writing over at Eutaw Street Report. You've seen him other places covering the Orioles. Of course, you see him on Twitter during the games as well. And Dillon, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, Connor. It's a pleasure.
And so we're talking about two guys here who were certainly not the most important parts of why the Orioles bullpen it ended top 10, but for most of the year was top 5 in baseball. You know, the big three was obviously Dylan Tate, Cionel Perez, and Felix Bautista. And there was even a time early in the year where you could argue that like Keegan Aiken was more important than these two guys with how well he was pitching. But by the end of the year, we kind of saw Bryan Baker emerge as almost the number 2 option at times. And early in the year, Joey Krehbiel was getting some big innings. There was that extra inning game in Tampa where Mountcastle had the big hit in the 11th, and then Krehbiel came in to get the last out. He got a save this season. But I wanted to start with Joey Krehbiel. 29 years old. He's going to be 30 in December. The Orioles brought him over late in the 2021 season from the Rays off waivers. He was a guy who the Rays kind of liked, but just knew they couldn't keep on the 40-man roster. The O's picked him up. He was in, the bullpen at the end of the year on a terrible team. We didn't really think he'd survive the offseason. Then he did, and you realize, maybe the O's see something here. Then he's in the bullpen, and in the first half of the season, Dillon, he wasn't quite a high leverage guy, but he was a pretty reliable middle reliever there at the beginning part of the season.
Oh, absolutely it was. I mean, in the first half of the season, he had a 2.18 ERA with a 3.45 FIP and striking out almost 8 guys per 9 innings. I mean, he was getting some key outs there in those 6th and 7th innings for the O's bullpen. It was really pleasant surprise, and but then everything kind of dwindled in the second half with a 6.20 ERA, and basically ever since he returned from the injured list when he went down with the right shoulder inflammation.
Yeah, he really was not the same pitcher after that. And it almost felt like he came back a little quick. I believe I remember it was the exact 15 days and he was right back in the bullpen. And I always wondered late in the year, like, did he need a couple weeks? Did he need another week? Maybe he did.
Yeah, I honestly think that's very possible. I mean, obviously we're not on the inside, so we don't see the everyday throwing sessions and everything like that. But it's kind of a proof is in the pudding type of ordeal where it was June 3rd when he went on the 15-day IL, and he was activated on June 18th. So it was the exact 15 days, and it wasn't just the ERA that skyrocketed. The FIP was also up in the 6s, but also the big telltale here was that his strikeout numbers decreased dramatically. I mean, he went from striking out almost 8 guys per 9 innings to under 6 per 9 innings. The walk rate was the same. Started giving up more homers, of course, and that's going to happen when you're not striking as many guys out. So it is very possible that that he could have used a little more time on the shelf.
Yeah, we just saw a lot more stuff in the middle of the plate from him late in the year. That led to some of the home runs as well. The final numbers for him, he made 56 appearances for the Orioles out of the bullpen this year. Did get one save, that one I mentioned in Tampa, but in 57 2/3 innings, Krehbiel had a 3.90 ERA with a 4.67 FIP this year. Just over 7 strikeouts per 9 with about 2.8 walks per 9 on the season. He was actually worth negative 0.3 WAR via Fangraphs. That's, he wasn't a complete disaster down the stretch, but he was giving up runs in some key spots, and that really hurt that WAR. And he ended up being, a negative player for the Orioles down the stretch. I mean, the 18% strikeout rate is below league average. The 7.4% walk rate also below league average, but the strikeouts just went down. And in the first half, it was really the changeup. You saw him throw that changeup to righties and lefties. He was a guy who Brandon Hyde would trust against both sides of the plate, which is big to have in a right-hander with a changeup like that. And, it's a pitch he throws about a third of the time. He basically throws it the same amount that he threw his fastball this year. You look at his pitch selection, 35% four-seamer, 33% changeup, 28% cutter. So he's almost a third. And guys hit only 183 against that changeup this year. So if you're looking at Joey Krehbiel, even with the struggles down the stretch, you're saying, where is the weapon still there? I think it's still that changeup if he's still going to have success moving forward.
I wholeheartedly agree there, and we'll touch on more with Bryan Baker later, but it's a very similar situation there as well, and you see both pitchers are mainly fastball, cutter, changeup pitchers, and with both Baker and Krehbiel, the cutter just hasn't been there, and the usage needs to go down there, and sometimes it's a little tough to only be a fastball changeup pitcher. So maybe those changeup numbers would not be as good as they are if he didn't have a cutter to at least show them, but it's clear that the cutter wasn't working there. The changeup was the bread and butter. And even though he was throwing the changeup pretty much as much as he was throwing the fastball, maybe he should have ended up being one of those types of pitcher that uses his off speed more than his fastball.
Yeah, I think we could see that moving forward. What I also think we could see from Joey Krehbiel is that he did have a fourth pitch. It was basically an extension of his cutter, but it was a slider. Now, he only threw it 4% of the time, but the cutter came in at 86. The slider came in at about 80. He only threw it against right-handers this year, basically never threw it against lefties. But it's a pitch I feel like that maybe this offseason he tries to hone it a little bit more. So maybe the cutter usage comes down, the slider usage maybe comes up to kind of meet that pitch. But the good thing about Krehbiel, as I mentioned, you look at his stats versus righties and lefties. It wasn't like he was this big reverse splits guy, but he was pretty even. So, whether he was up early in the year or when, he had his down stretches late in the year, both ways, he got righties and lefties out. And that's why he actually had a good amount of extended appearances this year for the O's. He could routinely pitch more than one inning. And that was because Brandon Hyde felt comfortable. If it was lefty, righty coming up in a lineup, he was comfortable sending Krehbiel out against those guys because he would go with, the fastball and the cutter against the righties. And he would just hammer that changeup against the lefties. But we all know that it looked ugly down the stretch. And he did not end his season where he wanted to be. He finishes the year in AAA, gets demoted that final week of the season just because it got so bad. He wasn't getting any high leverage spots, even when he was pitching. I mean, I remember the turning point of Orioles fans on Krehbiel was that crazy Astros game on that Saturday night when he pitched, I believe it was the fifth inning of that game with the Orioles having a 3-run lead, and it was the bottom of the Astros order. And he gave up the lead completely. He got one out. And the bottom of the order in a fifth inning 3-run game was like the highest leverage he had pitched in a while. So you could tell from that point, he was kind of falling out of favor for Brandon Hyde, which takes me to where we are. Because again, it was his first big league season, but he's going to be 30 years old going into next year. That certainly doesn't mean he's over the hill by any stretch, especially as a reliever, but he was a late bloomer getting to the big leagues with the Rays last year. The O's are going to have a bit of a 40-man roster crunch. I want to get your thoughts on, because I don't think he is a lock at all to be on this team next year. I wanted to get your thoughts on, basically how nervous should Joey Krehbiel be, this offseason, starting with Rule 5 draft protections, and then when the Orioles hopefully start to sign some free agents.
I agree with you, Connor. I do not think he's a lock to stay on the 40-man roster. If there is a crunch there, he's certainly a player to be discussed. As far as keeping his major league hopes alive, that shouldn't be too much of a worry with him. If he does get DFA'd, he will catch on somewhere else in someone's bullpen and possibly even have a good 2023 season. But as far as the Orioles go, there is going to be a crunch. And if he does survive the 40-man and ends up coming into spring training with the team, I think that there's an outside chance for him to make the opening day roster in the bullpen. There's going to be a lot of spots up for grabs. in that bullpen, but outside of the main options at the back end. But I do think he is on the outside looking in.
Yeah, and it's so interesting for Krehbiel because I completely agree. If he gets DFA'd, he's going to get claimed by somebody. And, that's how it was with the Rays. The Rays knew, if we DFA this guy, he's going to get claimed, but we have to DFA him. And it's funny that, the Orioles haven't had a lot of players over the last few years where they've been in this exact situation where it was like, he's a roster bubble guy, but if we DFA him, we're not getting him back. Most of the roster bubble guys over the last few years, you could pass them through waivers fairly easily and keep them around. That's not going to be the case for some of these guys this offseason. And that's kind of where Joey Krehbiel falls. And you know what? I think that's a good sign for the Orioles. Just when you look at the big picture, that they have guys on the fringes of the roster who other teams are going to want. Like there is no chance Joey Krehbiel pass, even if, he makes it, just to the Reds or something, or to the Diamondbacks or whomever, teams that just need relievers and arms, he's going to get snatched up immediately. So I think that spells definitely some good things for the Orioles. But coming up next, we are going to talk a little bit more about a guy who actually struggled a little bit early, but then finished a whole lot stronger than Krehbiel, and that is Bryan Baker. But first, got to tell you about Rhone, because the dress shirt, it was due for a radical reinvention, and Rhone stepped up to the challenge. Rhone's commuter shirt is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible shirt known to man. And here's why. Rhone's comfortable 4-way stretch fabric provides breathability and flexibility that leaves you free to enjoy what life throws your way, from your commute to work or to 18 holes on the golf course. And you can feel confident with a wrinkle-free shirt with no hassle. And with Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rhone, the shirt's 100% machine washable, so you can ditch the dry cleaner for these new dress shirts. So this commuter shirt can get you through any work day and straight into whatever comes next. So head to Rhone.com/lockedon, use promo code LOCKEDON to save 20% off your order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/lockedon and use the code LOCKEDON. It's time to find your corner office comfort. So we're here with Dillon Atkinson talking about the 2022 seasons of Joey Krehbiel and Bryan Baker, two right-handed relievers who had their first full big league season. Both were still considered rookies here in 2022. Now for Krehbiel, he had a little time with the Orioles in 2021 at the end of the year. And he came in, started off hot, as we talked about, and then he finished ice cold. And I think he's definitely on the roster bubble going into next year. Bryan Baker was a little different. He was claimed in the offseason off waivers from the Blue Jays. He makes the Orioles opening day bullpen. We really didn't know much about him other than he was the AAA closer for Toronto, and he'd had one big league appearance in 2021 with them before getting DFA'd. And what we saw early was like, hey, this guy looks like a solid fifth inning guy. Then what we saw in the middle of the year was this guy might need to go to AAA. And then Dillon at the end of the year, I mean, there wasn't many other guys besides Felix Bautista that I was trusting more than Bryan Baker over those last maybe 3 weeks of the season. That's something that was surprising to say, but he was locked down at the end of the year.
Yeah, he really was. And really, I think he won over a lot of Orioles fans as far as looking toward the future. I mean, even though his first half was not that great, and even though he had a 251 FIP and looked like good things were possibly to come, there were a lot of Orioles fans who were like, who is this guy? Get him out of here. But I think he won over a lot of Orioles fans with how he pitched in the second half. Not only that, but also how much he kind of fit in with the clubhouse, on the field, especially any appearance that related to Toronto Blue Jays. I mean, there's a fire there for, being DFA'd after making only one big league appearance. And he makes sure to let them know every single time he faces them that he's going to stare right into their dugout and say, yep, you missed out on me. Now, whether or not they do miss out on him, I'm not sure. But I think it's something that Orioles fans appreciate, that he's on our side now rather than the Blue Jays, and he has a fire toward Toronto when there's a fire there burning from Orioles fans as well.
It's so funny to look at that appearance, the appearance where he, gave the little talking sign to the Blue Jays, the dugout's cleared, and it was the only game of that huge 4-game series that the Orioles won was that Bryan Baker game. He actually did give up a run in that game, but if you remember, he put runners on the corners, then he got a huge double play and then got out of the inning. That was the last run he gave up. That moment, that was the last run he gave up of the season. That moment legitimately fired him up. And he looked around and he said, you know what? There's some spots to be earned in this bullpen for next year. And he rattled off 12 consecutive scoreless appearances to end the season. He was just ridiculous down the stretch for the Orioles. And I mean, there were some times out there. I mean, Dillon, I don't know if you remember that second to last appearance of the year. It was at Yankee Stadium. I believe the Orioles had already been eliminated. And he threw 2 perfect innings, striking out 5 of 6 Yankee batters.
He was pumped.
And he was throwing 99 up in the zone, striking out Aaron Judge. And I just looked at that, and I right then and there said, he's locked in for the bullpen next year. I was wondering if you agree. Do you think he's got a locked in spot for next year?
There is absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, for him to finish the second half with a 2.70 ERA, a 3.05 FIP, he's striking out close to 10 guys per 9 innings. And that's all in his first big league season. You know, he was still learning his way along the way. I have him locked in to the bullpen. I think he's possibly your 7th inning guy. And I think where the tide kind of turned for him in the season, where in the first half when he was struggling, Orioles fans wanted him in AAA. And in the second half of the season, if they had anything to gripe about it, it wasn't necessarily directed at Bryan Baker anymore. It was more so a possible gripe with the situations that Brandon Hyde was throwing him into. And, you know, I mean, with the stats, bases empty, had a 213 weighted on base average against them. Men on base 352. So that skyrocketed big time. I think there were quite a few appearances where Hyde was bringing him in 7th innings, 8th innings of close games, men on base, gives up those base hits. It doesn't attack his ERA, but fans remember, you know. And I think there were some spots that Hyde could have shied away from him in, but point blank, he got the job done for more than what you could have expected out of a waiver claim rookie. And one other thing to note that we haven't touched on yet, he keeps the ball in the ballpark. He only gave up 3 home runs on the entire season across nearly 70 innings. You know, I think there's a lot of value in that, especially when he's not even particularly a ground ball pitcher. He keeps the ball in the ballpark, and I think there's a lot of value there.
Yeah, he stays away from some hard contact. And about the, Brandon Hyde thing, I think Hyde and the Orioles saw what he could be. And of course, we saw it down the stretch. But they put him out there because of kind of the stuff he has. And I'll get to it in a second. Just wanted to read off kind of the final stats for him. So, he's a rookie. He pitches 66 games for the Orioles this year. I mean, that was right up there with how much Tate and Perez and Bautista ended up getting used. He did make 2 starts because remember, he started those 2 bullpen games, which I believe the Orioles won both of them when they did that with Bryan Baker this year. He did have a save, but in 69 2/3 innings, he had a 3.49 ERA with a 2.74 FIP, 9.8 Ks per 9, about 3.3 walks per 9 on the season, and worth 1.4 WAR according to Fangraphs. And the big thing with Bryan Baker, why the Orioles continue to believe in him, why Brandon Hyde continued to put him in big spots, even when it looked like he was struggling. Eno Saris over at The Athletic has his Stuff Plus model, which is just a number that just looks at a pitcher's stuff. It doesn't look at how many strikes they throw or, what their ERA is. And it can be flawed because, a guy like, Tanner Scott, when he was really bad, was really good at Stuff Plus because he was a lefty throwing 100 with a wipeout slider. Now, Tanner Scott had no idea where the ball was going, so it's not an exact formula.
The same thing was happening with DL Hall as well after his major league debut.
Exactly. But the only 2 pitchers on the Orioles this year who had a better Stuff Plus rating than Bryan Baker were kind of the 2 obvious ones, DL Hall and Felix Bautista. Those were the only 2 guys above him. So if you're just looking at raw stuff out of the bullpen, Baker had the 3rd best stuff on anyone on the staff, and that's not somebody you can just get rid of. And that's what I was saying all year. Even when I wasn't a big fan of him being used in like the 8th inning because he was having his struggles, I was still saying, look, it's in there. And he's still a rookie, even though he is 27 years old. He is still a rookie. They're going to find something here. And he found it at the end of the year. And you mentioned stuff a little bit earlier, but, he was heavy on the fastball this year. The 4-seamer used it about 56% of the time. It was, 95, 97, but he was 98, 99, 100 at the end of the year. Then he used that cutter about 26% of the time. And then the one pitch I wanted to touch on, which you mentioned, was the changeup. because he only threw it 17% of the time. And you look at the numbers, and opponents were 2 for 45 against his changeup with 25 strikeouts. And you think, how is that your third most used pitch when guys are hitting 0.44 against it with no extra base hits? Well, the answer, Dillon, is if you watched him in the first 4 months of the season, he had no idea where that changeup was going.
Yeah, I remember that those first couple of months, he was really fastball cutter, and that's where all the gripes from the Orioles fans was coming. Was anybody nowadays can hit 98 down the middle, and that's what Bryan Baker was throwing, was 98 down the middle, and just kind of sit some floating cutters in there, and no third offering, because that changeup, just like you said, he couldn't get it to work for him. I don't know if he couldn't find the right grip on it, or what it was, or if it was, I'm honestly not even sure what his experience with the changeup was when he was in the Blue Jays minors. I'm not sure if it was a new pitch for him or what. For all we know, maybe it was a pitch that Joey Krehbiel worked with him on. Who knows? Because their repertoires are exactly the same: fastball, cutter, changeup. But once he finally started to hone in that change, it was unhittable. And I can't remember the amount of times that you would see Pitching Ninja just posting videos of Bryan Baker, and it was just steady doses of changeups and just making guys look silly. I mean to give up a 0.44 batting average against, I mean, come on.
That's good.
And you got nearly a 38% whiff percentage on your changeup. I think now that he has had a good amount of experience in honing in that changeup, I think we're going to see that usage percentage skyrocket next year. I think we're going to see him more so be that fastball changeup kind of pitcher, those two primarily, but probably also mixing in that cutter to at least be more of a show me pitch to set up the changeup.
Yeah, and the thing with it, he finally got that changeup command down late in the year. And it coincided with him going with the 12 straight scoreless appearances. I mean, he was able to start it above the zone, drop it in. He could drop it off the table to left-handers. I mean, it looked like when Krehbiel was going early in the year. Heck, it really looked like when Cole Salser was going last year for the Orioles with that changeup. It would just fall apart and nobody knew what to do with it. And another thing that it reminded me of a little bit, and I think it's because of the massive velo difference, because at the end of the year, he was throwing fastballs at 98 and changeups at like 83 and 84. It kind of looked like the old Cesar Valdez dead fish at times, the way guys would swing at it, because it was such a difference from his fastball. And it looked like it was almost knuckling in there and floating in there. And then the bottom would just drop out of that pitch. So yeah, he's going to work on the command. Listen, I think he's still going to come back next year with his cutter, because you could tell he has confidence in that pitch to throw it in the strike zone. It's basically his get me over pitch. Now, the issue is if you're throwing a pitch 26% of the time, and opponents are hitting 324 against it, you might want to lower that usage a little bit. I don't think he'll get rid of it. What I do think we could see is kind of add the slider or the sweeper like Krehbiel did. Krehbiel only threw it 4% of the time, but maybe if you get 10% of the sweeper for Baker, you bring down the cutter and you jack up that changeup because you get the usage back. The fastball is good. It's got high spin up in the zone. You're still throwing 96 to 98. I think he's got a repertoire next year. And it was funny to see Orioles fans, I think, really have some good insight on Bryan Baker late in the year. And everyone was just kind of like, stop throwing your cutter. And when you watched him pitch, you were just like, he should stop throwing his cutter, but he also has no idea where his changeup's going. So if he would come in, he would throw a changeup 55 feet and then throw onto the backstop. And he'd just be like, I don't have it today. And everyone would be like, don't throw your cutter. And I'd be like, I agree. But if you only have a four-seam fastball, you're just not going to get guys out. So I think maybe if he's still not 100% has the feel on that changeup, maybe it's an addition of a slider or extending that cutter. But I think he will make a change this offseason. And I think I really do think we're going to see a dominant reliever out of Bryan Baker next year.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it could be a learning curve a bit because of what he has limited in his repertoire between still getting the feel for that changeup and figuring out what he's going to do with the cutter, whether he's going to keep it the same and just dial it down a little bit on the usage as more of a show me pitch, or if he's going to look to revamp the pitch in any way. I mean, we've seen it with Dylan Bundy in the past. turning that cutter into more of a sweeping slider of sorts. So, I think he's going to be working on that cutter in the offseason, because in order for him to take that next step, he's going to need to either make an adjustment on his pitch usage and locations, especially with the cutter, because like you said, the cutter was more of a show me pitch that he was able to throw strikes with. And oftentimes opposing batters made him pay for leaving that in the strike zone. It was more of a floater cutter up there. And there were some times where you've seen him, missing way off the plate to right-handed batters with the cutters, and it wasn't even an enticing pitch. So it was either right over the heart of the plate, or not even an enticing pitch whatsoever. So I think the cutter is going to be something he works on tremendously in the offseason on whether it's going to be improving the cutter in its own, or kind of revamping it, or tinkering it with it in a way to see if he can turn it more into a slider.
And similar to Krehbiel, but with more success. I mean, Baker could go multiple innings. We saw him start some games and pitch into the second. And just like Krehbiel, he's pretty much an even split. Like, he gets lefties and righties out basically at the same rate because of that changeup that he has. And he can throw the cutter in on the hands of lefties, which sometimes did work. Not a lot of the times, but sometimes did work. And so that helps you too. You can send him through a lineup, send him through 7 guys because you're not worried righty or lefty. So Dillon, here's how we're going to finish. You could say this guy's going to be the closer. You could say this guy is not even going to be on the team next year. Predict the 2023 role in the Oriole bullpen for Bryan Baker and for Joey Krehbiel.
For Bryan Baker and Joey Krehbiel. Okay, I'm going to start with Joey Krehbiel, and my gut is actually telling me that he will not get DFA'd. I think he'll be in spring training, but I don't think he'll make the opening day roster. He's, according to Fangraphs, he still has 2 options remaining. So I think he will he'll start the season in AAA, and I think he will be one of those relievers that stretches the max limit that you can send a guy up and down per the new rules. So I think he'll be a shuttle guy, be okay at times, but they're not going to use him in even any medium leverage situations. It'll all more so be mop up role type ordeals, or just to get an arm up if the previous day was a lot of usage. For Bryan Baker, I think he's opening the season, unless there is a major offseason addition to the bullpen, whether it's a free agent signing, trade, whatever it may be. I think Bryan Baker is opening the season as your 7th inning guy, and I think there's potential there to finish the season as even your setup man in the 8th inning. I think he still has work to do to take that next step, but I think there's potential in there to take that next step.
I'm going to say for Joey Krehbiel, I don't think he survives the offseason. I have confidence that the Orioles are going to add to this bullpen. I think a big marker there is that he did get demoted to AAA. I mean, even with struggles, the O's could have just left him up in the big leagues. And it's not like he went to get work at AAA. Like, the Norfolk season was over when he got sent down. So I think that was a big tell for me that, like, they might be moving on from him, because as Mike Elias showed this year, he's confident in building a bullpen off the waiver wire, off of, guys in AAA. And I just think, I tweeted this near the end of the year when Krehbiel was struggling. I just said, like, salute to Joey Krehbiel. The Orioles basically squeezed all of the good reliever juice out of him basically this year. And I think they're kind of going to move on with him. Now, I will say he's going to get DFA'd, I think. I don't think he's passing through waivers. Somebody like Arizona or Kansas City or, Washington, somebody's going to bring him in, and he's going to be in the opening day bullpen, I think, for a bad baseball team next year, and be in like a 6th, 7th inning role. For Bryan Baker, I think for the majority of next year, he's going to be the Orioles' 2nd best reliever behind Felix Bautista. Now, I don't know what role that puts him in, whether he's pitching the 7th or 8th or 6th. He could be all of them. But I think he will kind of be in that role where, hey, Felix is down for a day, maybe Baker goes for the save. Or, Baker throws, gets out of the bases loaded in the 7th, finishes the 8th, and they go to Felix Bautista in the 9th. I really believe in his stuff. And if he can figure out that changeup, I think it's going to be good. And this is just a funny conversation to have, because if you go back 2 months, people would be calling us crazy for having this kind of conversation about Bryan Baker, but he certainly proved himself at the end of the year. But Dillon, thank you so much for joining us. Fun conversation about two middle relievers. And it's funny, doing these series the last couple of years, if we were talking about two middle relievers, we'd be out of here in about 5 minutes. And I'd just be like, yeah, they were bad and they might not be on the Orioles next year. But this was an incredible bullpen. They gave us stuff to talk about. And I thank you again for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Connor. And yes, I do agree that it's very fun to talk about two middle relievers this year. But one more point on Joey Krehbiel, a 3.9 ERA, and we're talking about a DFA. If it was after 2021, he'd be entering the 2022 as the closer.
Yeah. I mean, it's a new world out there for the Orioles. It is certainly a new world, and it's fun to see them have to make tough decisions. The Rays, where Krehbiel came from, they make these decisions all the time, but it's tough to have to see it's fun, I should say, to have to watch the Orioles make these tough decisions. But that was Dillon Atkinson. We thank him so much for joining us. We'll be back for one more episode this week, continuing our player review series on the Orioles' fantastic 2022 season. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.